My name is Daniel Fergus, campus librarian at Illinois Central College's Peoria campus, and this lesson is called How to Read a Research Article. In this lesson, you will learn about what the term research means in scholarly literature, what a research article is, its typical structure, concentrating on APA format, and how you can use that information strategically and pull important information from the article without having to read it in its entirety. There are different levels for various types of sources, and a good first step to recognizing if the source you have may be considered research is to recognize the level of the source that you have before you. I have listed here the two most commonly found in scholarly journals. Filtered or secondary sources are summaries and analyses of the evidence derived from and based on primary sources. They provide an appraisal of the quality of the studies and often make recommendations for practice. Commonly, they are not written by those directly involved in the actual research being written about, so it has gone through a filter or being written about secondhand. So when you see words or phrases like review, systematic review, literature review, analysis, or meta-analysis in the description, title, or abstract of the article, that will be an indication that it is likely a secondary source. What we are going to be looking for specifically in a research article is going to be considered a primary source, or sometimes called unfiltered. Primary sources are generally found in peer-reviewed journals, which is the highest level of academic publication. Another good word to think about is empirical. You may have learned that term in various science classes. It means directly observed. Primary research will be directly observed or empirical, so that will help with the identification as well. Note that there is another level of source which is called tertiary, or sometimes called gray literature. These are sources that combine information from both primary and secondary sources, such as reference articles, book entries, books, popular and trade magazines, news sources, etc. They can still be very good sources to use for reliable information, but it is important to understand the hierarchy of scholarship and where primary research fits. So, as you can see, there is a little bit of a difference between our casual daily use of the word research and the fact that means something very specific in the realm of scientific literature. So now that we are aware of the various levels of academic writing, the next step for identifying and writing about research is to understand how primary research articles are structured. These are the typical sections or elements of a research study. Note that this is not cookie cutter. You may see some variation on this, and we'll discuss that later in this lesson. But the most common structure is as follows. First, you will have your title and your abstract, then an introduction, or sometimes called background, your materials and methods, subjects or participants, then you will have results, followed by a discussion and then a conclusion. A well-written title will be thorough, descriptive, and will include elements of the main topic and probably the subjects of the study. It should also give the searcher or reader a clear idea of what they will find in the article. So as you can imagine, this probably means you will have very long titles. This isn't intended to make putting your references page together a pain, because it is intentional. If you can imagine working in a critical survival situation and your employer tasks you with finding the latest research on a particular disease or condition, you will want to know at the title level what you will get when you are searching. The abstract will provide a very brief summary of the article. Usually it'll only be about a paragraph. In instances where you find 2 paragraphs, you will commonly find that the second may discuss the authors or declare any relevant disclosure information. The abstract is separate from the main body of the article and sometimes will even be broken down into sections similar to a small version of the article with an intro, background, subjects, results, and conclusion. Now we move on to the main body of the article. The first section is always the introduction, although it may sometimes not be labeled, and other times it may have a different name, such as background. The introduction will describe the topic and define key terms and concepts, as well as outline the purpose of the study. It will explain why the study is being done and important, and can include a review of literature. The first step in any research project is to conduct a thorough search of the literature and to ensure that this work has not already been undertaken, or if it has, to attempt to clarify or reinforce previous findings by addressing identified limitations from previous studies. We'll talk more about those limitations later, but when you publish your research, you will be expected to outline where the existing knowledge on the topic stands, and wherever that takes place in the article, that is called the literature review. Sometimes it will be a labeled section on its own in the paper, but more commonly it is embedded in one of several key areas of the article. It can also pop up in other parts of the article, and I'll discuss that as we go. Since you will be citing lots of different articles in a literature review, look for a heavy concentration of in-text citations or superscript numbers, as that will be a good indication of where they are talking about all of the existing literature. Then you have your materials section. This is where you will specify the instruments, equipment, measuring or assessment tools used. You'll explain how the authors are obtaining data, how it's entered, stored, retrieved, and you may include a full survey or questionnaire if that's being used. And this can also be done as a table or a figure for easy identification. Next, you have the methods section. This is where you provide an overview of how the research process is taking place. You'll explain more process information on how data is being collected and who is responsible for it. Then you will discuss your variables. A variable is something that is presented as a possible weakness or vulnerability in the research plan. It could be something like gender, socioeconomic status, a known lack of honesty from participants in answering certain questions, as some examples. When you know these going into the research or they emerge during the research process, they are variables. If they impact making evidence-based decisions from the results, then they become a limitation. And again, we'll talk more about those later. Finally, you will provide a chronological step-by-step description of the entire research process from start to finish. Subjects, or sometimes labeled as participants, is where you will describe the population being studied. Most commonly, you will focus on age, location, gender, ethnicity, diagnosis, those types of things. And they can be more than one of those as well. You will discuss the process for recruiting subjects, how they were identified, selected, and maybe even excluded. If multiple facilities are involved, the authors will discuss their role in the subject recruitment process as well, and maybe even how facilities were identified and selected. So the authors have written what they're doing, who they are looking at, why they are doing it, and how and where they are doing the research. The research has been concluded, and now they're going to shift to the results and the findings. In the results section, you will provide the raw data in narrative form in the body of the paper, but you may also provide tables for easier digestion from the reader. To present the data both ways is pretty common, though not technically required in APA format. You'll highlight what the data shows and start to suggest what next steps may be taken, and then you will elaborate briefly on why the data shown is significant. In some cases, it may not be, so you will find authors may be painfully honest and say that as well. After all the data has been presented, the authors in a research study will use a discussion section where they will address each of the original research questions, make direct connections from the results to the relevant existing literature. So a discussion section is another common place for a literature review to appear. Especially in a shorter article, authors may opt to include that in only one section, such as the intro or discussion or conclusion. They will also analyze results through comparisons and contrasts, how the findings may be incorporated into clinical practice, and finally discuss the limitations of the study. As we briefly mentioned earlier, weaknesses in the results that may stem from unforeseen factors are identified as limitations in a study. This can sometimes be a standalone section, but most commonly is embedded or mentioned in the narrative of the discussion section. And then the last section of the main body of the paper will be the conclusion section, where the authors will state their final conclusions and make recommendations for further research. It is sometimes common for shorter articles to have only a discussion or conclusion and include the relevant elements of the other. With all this in mind, I want to revisit slide 4. I mentioned earlier that this is a typical structure, but not all articles will have this exact structure. You may not have all of these sections. There may be sections that are barely relevant, or such as just outlined, having just one section instead of two. Some common approaches are either discussion or conclusion, or combined materials and methods section. You may have additional suggestions, such as a literature review or limitations. You may have subsections, such as recruitment, identification, and exclusion under subjects. You may also have noticed that there is some overlap in what you include in certain sections of a research study. This is intentional. In a shorter paper, you may find fewer sections. In a much longer paper, you may find that most, if not all, of the sections are really miniature versions of the entire article. They would still focus appropriately on what is relevant in the section in question, but you may find that they provide a little bit of the background, discuss the subject, highlight the results, make those connections to the research questions to help the reader more easily observe the entire scope of the article. So you don't necessarily need to be afraid of an 89-page paper if you know how to tackle it. And we'll have a demo in just a few moments that will show you how to put what we've covered so far today into practice. The last part of every published paper is everyone's favorite, the references page. This is where the authors will list every source that they've referred to in the paper. But where a preference page can be incredibly helpful is it can help point you in the direction of additional material on the topic. It can provide breadcrumbs that will lead you to authors, institutes, organizations, keywords and concepts, related publications, and all of those things can become potential keywords that you can plug into your search and yet find still more information. So what we've just discussed and learned is what the typical structure for what we would consider a primary research article would be. And back to the very first slide, we learned a little bit about what is not considered primary research. So this is just a little more information on how to identify what may not be primary research. So the following kinds of articles are not considered primary research. A systematic review. So these are similar to a literature review, but it's summarizing findings of existing research. Therefore, it is a secondary source. Oftentimes it's structured like a research article, so again the tip here is to remember a research study will basically have one set of participants or subjects going through the same treatment or intervention. In a systematic review, in the subject section, they will talk about many different groups of subjects, so that's one area you can go to identify that. A literature review basically just summarizes the content and scope of existing research without getting into the technical findings or the data. So no original research is included, it's just secondary. A meta-analysis analyzes the statistics and data of existing research, really gets into the data and trying to make statistical inferences from it. So therefore, it's a secondary source again. One type of article that you may run across, and I do not have a slide for, is a randomized control trial. Now, usually these are allowable, and they are a primary research study, but you are strongly encouraged to check with your teacher on whether or not you may use such an article. For some instructors and assignments are okay, and others they may not be, just kind of determined based on faculty preference. But essentially, they are the same as an empirical research study. But where they differ is that it's typically the last step of research to verify the efficacy of a new treatment or intervention. The only difference really is that the main pool of subjects is split into two groups, one who will receive the active intervention and then the control group who will receive a placebo. So it's really one pool of participants that's split into two, where one's getting the treatment and the other isn't. And that's typically the last step in scientific research to verify the efficacy of a particular treatment or intervention. So it would be considered primary research. I just don't have a slide for that here. So to wrap things up for this portion of today's lesson, is there just to provide some information on how you can get more help from ICC Library. So there are a number of ways that you can get in touch with us. The best way is to contact there are a number of ways that you can get in touch with the library. The best way is to connect with a live library. There are a number of ways that you can get in touch with the library for help. The best way to connect with a live librarian is via our chat interface from the library homepage, icc.edu/library. Our summer hours that ICC Library is staffing, Monday through Thursday, 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. and Friday, 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. There is a 24/7 answering service that you can still chat with a live librarian from somewhere in the world, but the hours that are listed here, you can connect with an ICC librarian. The answering service has a great ticketing system, so they're professional librarians like we are, so they'll be able to help you. The one thing they may not necessarily be able to do is directly access ICC's resources, but they can point you in the direction of what we have. They can also create a ticket if they're not able to fully help you, and then those tickets get sent back to us, and one of us will follow up with you at our next available opportunity. You can also schedule appointments via icc.mywconline.com. This is the same platform used by the Academic Support Center for scheduling tutoring appointments. It's still active for summer 2023, but we are in the process of moving to BrainFuse in early July. This will hopefully be a significant upgrade for tutoring, writing, library, and live one-on-one face-to-face support. So watch for more information on how to use that platform to schedule tutoring and library research appointments in the very near future. But in the meantime, use icc.mywconline. You can also email me directly. Again, my name is Daniel Furgis, and my ICC email address is df145a@icc.edu. Which is a lot easier than trying to spell out my name for the long format of the email address. So now that you've learned about what the structure of a primary research article is and how to identify certain key elements and differentiate from other types of literature, we're going to do a brief demo on how you can put this into practice. And when I see you in class, we'll do an activity that will put this into, you'll actually get to practice doing this on an article yourself.